Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 13. The Hunter Cometh. In the old world, Nicodemus had occupied the great cold stone halls of lords. His title had allowed him a remote castle built up from a rocky hill to overlook a lake. He could have been affixed over a river so that he might tax the riparian trade into and out of his duchy. He might have even managed a spot aside the Rhine itself, but instead he had, subtly, maneuvered himself toward a place just remote enough to partake in court when it suited him, while distant enough to make the journey troublesome for unwanted guests. This had allowed him reasonable peace until the more zealous factions of Puritans had, quietly, begun to gain footholds and favors. From island England, the silent crusade had spread, their hunts ignoring blue bloodlines, bypassing political insulation, and indifferent to raw wealth. It was only a matter of time before this baleful eye was cast in his direction. Once the dark efforts of Nicodemus to exonerate himself failed, he had fled his home, his country, even the continent. And now, half a world away, he had managed to build a little slice of something not entirely worthless. It was not grandiose or auspicious by any stretch of the imagination. However, considering what he had to work with, both in crude materiel and mind-slaved manpower, Nicodemus did feel a begrudging satisfaction with the result. His new keep was simple, rough-hewn stone, erected in as decent a fashion as his shirked studies in architecture allowed. The square fort and its single spire was set against a mountain in a pine forest overseeing a lake, and while it did lack in the finer things, it was as good as he was going to manage in the wildlands of the New World. When he woke, the first hint of trouble was the scent of blood, followed ever so swiftly by the repugnant scent of fire underscored by sulfur. Nicodemus sprang from sleep, his long black hair awry, and made to take the first steps toward action, but already found his options limited, for even in the immediate cues of scent and sound, he realized this was not mere trouble, but grave danger. From the disparate war cries and death sounds, he deduced that precious few of his servants remained, and with the sun full up, his more savage servants were relegated to the innermost portions of the manor, and even these were far more rare than he had wished, for due to lack of the sound of a flintlock shot reached Nicodemus, this followed by the death shriek of one of those precious few guard dogs. Armed with silver shot, had some fanatic tracked him halfway across the world? Impossible. While certainly egotistical, Nicodemus could not conceive of such a single-minded pursuit, not when there were plenty of other more immediate threats back in the old country. A quiet, heavy onslaught of padded feet could be heard running across the bare stones of the keep's passages as the final 5 werewolves converged on the sound of the intruder's gun. A second shot rang out, followed by the sounds of a sword and meaty struggle. The scent of the dog's unnatural blood reached Nicodemus's sensitive nose, and cold, powerless panic began to settle upon his unbeating heart. He had not finished preparations for a daytime escape. A low priority, he had thought there had been no need. The sounds of struggle died almost as swiftly as they had started. A final pitiable whine was ended with the definitive strike of an abrupt sword thrust. Silence followed. Nicodemus considered hiding, but despite his desperate desire to run, there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Well, if this was to be it. He rallied his pride, remembered his origins, his reign, his bearing, and when the twin doors to his master bedroom were thrown open, Nicodemus stood in the center of the room, his dark, red eyes cold, his manner as defiant and haughty as if a commoner had stumbled into his great castle back home. The man before him was nearly as tall as Nicodemus, and almost as lean. His garb was entirely black and functional, as his kind seemed wont to do, though his head was not capped by the expected stovepipe of a Puritan, but rather a flat, broad-brimmed hat rested there, which, if one side had been folded and a great plume added, Nicodemus would have been reminded of a musketeer, though he noted the man's black cape was slung and cut in the manner of a British skirmisher. The man in black raised a presumably reloaded flintlock pistol and approached apace. Both individuals well aware that even a silver round would not end Nicodemus, but it would render him vulnerable enough for the coup de grace, his final threat personified by the wooden stake the invader held in his left leather-gloved hand. Nicodemus could feel his shoulders slump a bit at this sight, even as his eyes narrowed, resolved and resolute. "By what token?" wondered Nicodemus aloud in accented but well-spoken English. "Does my fate reach me?" His enemy's ice-blue eyes peered out from under the black hat's brim, unperturbed, calm, and pitiless. "Dumb luck," came the low, deep tone. "Nonsense. It is no mistake you are here, rather than in a warm home with family back in the old world. Even without aim, you are here by choice regardless." The man in black shook his head once, the movement slow and almost imperceptible. "I wander and act as I will, that is all. If there is aim or pattern, then that is God's hand." Nicodemus made a quiet hiss of disappointment. "I refused the potential for an elegant death when I fled my castle. The words and the realization were almost physically painful. For my cowardice, I suppose I opt to accept this fitting end." The man made no response for a moment, then, his voice even, "Unless you wish to die flat-footed, come." With a final haughty sneer directed at both his opponent and this inexorable fate, Nicodemus lunged, maw wide, his great vampiric teeth exposed and aching for this strong English blood. The conclusion was foregone. The sensation of white-hot silver laced through his brain, obliterating the ability to process reality. The intensity of this agony was utterly unnatural and distasteful, resulting in a cascade of repugnance erupting into a tapestry of unimaginable agony. It was as if his blood was made shivering fire, writhing like electrified worms in his long-dead veins. Perhaps he screamed, he did not know. Awareness had become an angry, elusive thing. But for a long last moment, he found focus enough for his blood-red eyes to become fixated on a wooden point and the black-gloved hand which gripped it tight. The stake plunged. Michael Irons rose swiftly from the rapid, almost explosive self-immolation of the corpse, his perpetually furrowed brow even more so than usual, still perplexed by this finding. If he were not mistaken, he had found an Austrian vampire in the New World. Irons' rudimentary, almost entirely mimed communication with the local tribe had prompted him to assume a misunderstanding on his part, but, strange as it was, there had indeed been a blood drinker occupying a stone home in the mountains. As the elders had requested, Irons set fire to the manor and tower before resuming his travels.